The Castles of Athlin and Dunbayne by Ann Radcliffe. Chapter 10. The Count was walking on the ramparts of the castle, involved in thought, when Osbert approached, whose lingering step and disappointed air spoke to his heart the rejection of his suit. He told the Count that Mary did not at present feel for him those sentiments of affection which would justify her in accepting his proposals. This information, though it shocked the hopes of the Count, did not entirely destroy them, for he yet believed but time and assiduity might befriend his wishes. While these noblemen were leaning on the walls of the castle, engaged in earnest conversation, they observed on a distant hill a cloud emerging from the verge of the horizon, whose dusky hue glittered with sudden light. In an instant they descried the glance of arms, and a troop of armed men poured in long succession over the hill and hurried down its side to the plains below. The Earl thought he recognized the clan of the Baron. It was the Baron himself who now advanced at the head of his people in search of that revenge which had been hitherto denied him, and who, determined on conquest, had brought with him a host which he thought more than sufficient to overwhelm the castle of his enemy. The messenger who had been sent with the challenge had been detained a prisoner by Malcolm, who in the meantime had hastened his preparations to surprise the castle of Athlin. The detention of his servant had awakened the suspicions of the Earl, and he had taken precautions to guard against the designs of his enemy. He had summoned his clan to hold themselves in readiness for a sudden attack, and had prepared his castle for the worst emergency. He now sent a messenger to the clan with such orders as he judged expedient, arranged his plans within the walls, and took his station on the ramparts to observe the movements of his enemy. The Count, clad in arms, stood by his side. Allen was posted with a party within the great gate of the castle. The Baron advanced with his people, and quickly surrounded the walls. Within all was silent. The castle seemed to repose in security, and the Baron, certain of victory, congratulated himself on the success of the enterprise, when observing the Earl, whose person was concealed in armor, he called to him to surrender himself and his chief to the arms of Malcolm. The Earl answered the summons with an arrow from his bow, which, missing the Baron, pierced one of his attendants. The archers who had been planted behind the walls now discovered themselves, and discharged a shower of arrows. At the same time, every part of the castle appeared thronged with the soldiers of the Earl, who hurled on the heads of the astonished besiegers lances and other missile weapons with unceasing rapidity. The alarm bell now rung out the signal to that part of the clan without the walls, and they immediately poured upon the enemy, who, confounded by this unexpected attack, had scarcely time to defend themselves. The clang of arms resounded through the air, with the shouts of the victors and the groans of the dying. The fear of the Baron, which had principally operated on the minds of his people, was now overcome by surprise, and the fear of death, and on the first repulse, they deserted from the ranks in great numbers and fled to a distant hills. In vain the Baron endeavored to rally his soldiers and keep them to the charge. They yielded to a stronger impulse than the menace of their chief, who was now left with less than half his number at the foot of the walls. The Baron, to whom cowardice was unknown, disdaining to retreat, continued the attack. At length the gates of the castle were thrown open, and a party issued upon the assailants, headed by the Earl and the Count, who divided in quest of Malcolm. The Count fought in vain, and the search of Osbert was equally fruitless. Their adversary was nowhere to be found. Osbert, apprehensive of his gaining admittance to the castle by stratagem, was returning in haste to the gates, when he received the stroke of a sword upon his shoulder. His armor had broke the force of the blow, and the wound it had given was slight. He turned his sword, and facing his enemy, discovered a soldier of Malcolm's who attacked him with a desperate courage. The encounter was furious and long. Dexterity and equal valor seemed to animate both the combatants. Allen, who observed from his post the danger of the Earl, flew instantly to his assistance, but the crisis of the scene was past ere he arrived. The weapon of Osbert had pierced the side of his adversary, and he fell to the ground. The Earl disarmed him, and holding over him his sword, bade him ask his life. "I have no life to ask," said Malcolm, whose fainting voice the Earl now discovered. "If I had, 'tis death only I would accept from you. Oh, cursed!" He would have finished the sentence, but his wound flowed apace, and he fainted with loss of blood. The Earl threw down his sword, and calling a party of his people, he committed to them the care of the Baron, and ordered them to proceed and seize the castle of Dunbayne. Understanding their chief was mortally wounded, the remains of Malcolm's army had fled from the walls. The people of the Earl proceeded without interruption, and took possession of the castle without opposition. The wounds of the Baron were examined when he reached Dunbayne, and the dubious sentence of the event was pronounced. His countenance marked the powerful workings of his mind, which seemed laboring with an unknown evil. He threw his eyes eagerly round the apartment, as if in search of some object which was not present. After several attempts to speak, "Flatter me not," said he, "with hopes of life. It is flitting fast away. But while I have breath to speak, let me see the Baroness." She came, and hanging over his couch in silent horror, received his words. "I have injured you, madam. I fear beyond reparation. In these last few moments let me endeavor to relieve my conscience by discovering to you my guilt and my remorse." The Baroness started, fearful of the coming sentence. "You had a son." "What of my son?" "You had a son, whom my boundless ambition doomed to exile from his parents and his heritage, and who I caused you to believe died in your absence." "Where is my child?" exclaimed the Baroness. "I know not," resumed Malcolm. "I committed him to the care of a man and woman, who then lived on a remote part of my lands. But a few years after they disappeared, and I have never heard of them since. The boy passed for a foundling whom I had saved from perishing. One servant only I entrusted with the secret. The rest were imposed upon. Thus far I tell you, madam, to prompt you to enquiry, and to assuage the agonies of a bleeding conscience. I have other deeds." The Baroness could hear no more. She was carried insensible from the apartment. Laura, shocked at her condition, was informed of its cause, and filial tenderness washed over her with unwearied attention. In the meantime, the Earl, on quitting Malcolm, had returned immediately to the castle, and was the first messenger of that event which would probably avenge the memory of his father and terminate the distresses of his family. The sight of Osbert and the news he brought revived the Countess and Mary, who had retired during the assault into an inner apartment of the castle for greater security, and who had suffered during that period all the terrors which their situation could inspire. They were soon after joined by the Count and by Allen, whose conduct did not pass unnoticed by the Earl. The cheek of Mary glowed at the relation of this new instance of his worth, and it was Allen's sweet reward to observe her emotion. There was a sentiment in the heart of Osbert which struggled against the pride of birth. He wished to reward the services and the noble spirit of the youth with the virtues of Mary, but the authority of early prejudice silenced the grateful impulse and swept from his heart the characters of truth. The Earl, accompanied by the Count, now hastened to the castle of Dunbayne to cheer the Baroness and her daughter with their presence. As they approached the castle, the stillness and desolation of the scene bespoke the situation of its lord. His people were entirely dispersed. A few only of his sentinels wandered before the eastern gate, who, having made no opposition, were suffered by the Earl's people to remain. Few of the Baron's people were to be seen. Those few were unarmed, and appeared the effigies of fallen greatness. As the Earl crossed the platform, the remembrance of the past crowded upon his mind. The agonies which he had there suffered, the image of death which glared upon his sight, aggravated by the bitter and ignominious circumstances which attended his fate, the figure of Malcolm, mighty in injustice and cruel in power, whose countenance, smiling horribly in triumphant revenge, sate to his heart the stroke of anguish. Each circumstance of torture arose to his imagination in the glowing colors of truth. He shuddered as he passed, and the contrast of the present scene touched his heart with the most affecting sentiments. He saw the innate and active power of justice, which pervades all the circumstances even of this life, like vital principle, and shines through the obscurity of human actions to the virtuous, the pure ray of heaven, to the guilty, the destructive glare of lightning. On inquiring for the Baroness, they were told she was in the apartment of Malcolm, whose moment of dissolution was now approaching. The name of the Count was delivered to the Baroness, and overheard by the Baron, who desired to see him. Louisa went out to receive her noble relation with all the joy which a meeting so desirable and so unlooked for could inspire. On seeing Osbert, her tears flowed fast, and she thanked him for his generous care in a manner that declared a deep sense of his services. Leaving him, she conducted the Count to Malcolm, who lay on his couch surrounded with the stillness and horrors of death. He raised his languid head, and discovered a countenance wild and terrific, whose ghastly aspect was overspread with the paleness of death. The beauteous Laura, overcome by the scene, hung like a drooping lily over his couch, dropping fast her tears. "My lord," said Malcolm in a low tone, "you see before you a wretch, anxious to relieve the agony of a guilty mind. My vices have destroyed the peace of this lady, have robbed her of a son, but she will disclose to you the secret guilt, which I have now no time to tell. I have for some years received, as you now well know, the income of these foreign lands which are her due. As a small reparation for the injury she has sustained, I bequeath to her all the possessions which I lawfully inherit, and resign her into your protection. To ask oblivion of the past of you, madam, and of you, my lord, is what I dare not do. Yet it would be some consolation to my departing spirit to be assured of your forgiveness." The Baroness was too much affected to reply, but by a look of assent. The Count assured him of forgiveness, and besought him to compose his mind for his approaching fate. "Composure, my lord, is not for me. My life has been marked with vice, and my death with the bitterness of fruitless remorse. I have understood virtue, that I have loved vice. I do not now lament that I am punished, but that I have deserved punishment." The Baron sunk on his couch, and in a few moments after expired in a strong sigh. Thus terminated the life of a man whose understanding might have reached the happiness of virtue, but whose actions displayed the features of vice. From this melancholy scene, the Baroness, with the Count and Laura, retired to her apartment, where the Earl awaited their return with anxious solicitude. The sternness of justice for a moment relaxed when he heard of Malcolm's death. His heart would have sighed with compassion had not the remembrance of his father crossed his mind and checked the impulse. "I can now, madam," said he, addressing the Baroness, "restore you a part of those possessions which were once your lord's, and which ought to have been the inheritance of your son. This castle from henceforth is yours. I resign it to its lawful owner." The Baroness was overcome with the remembrance of his services, and could scarcely thank him but with her tears. The servant whom the Baron had mentioned as the confidant of his iniquities was sent for, and interrogated concerning the infant he had charge of. From him, however, little comfort was received, for he could only tell that he had conveyed the child, by the orders of his master, to a cottage on the furthest borders of his estates, where he had delivered it to the care of a woman who there lived with her husband. These people received at the same time a sum of money for its support, with the promise of future supplies. For some years he had been punctual in the payment of the sums entrusted to him by the Baron, but at length he yielded to the temptation of withholding them for his own use, and on inquiring for the people some years after, he found they were gone from the place. The conditions of the Baroness's pardon to the man depended on his endeavors to repair the injury he had promoted by a strict search for the people to whom he had committed her child. She now consulted with her friends on the best means to be pursued in this business, and immediately sent off messengers to different parts of the country to gather information. The Baroness was now released from oppression and imprisonment. She was reinstated in her ancient possessions, to which were added all the hereditary lands of Malcolm, together with his personal fortune. She was surrounded by those whom she most loved, and in the midst of a people who loved her. Yet the consequence of the Baron's guilt had left in her heart one drop of gall, which embittered each source of happiness, and made her life melancholy and painful. The Count was now her visitor. She was much consoled by his presence, and Laura's hours were often enlivened by the conversation of the Earl, to whom her heart was tenderly attached, and whose frequent visits to the castle were devoted to love and her. The felicity of Matilda now appeared as perfect and as permanent as is consistent with the nature of sublunary beings. Justice was done to the memory of her lord, and her beloved son was spared to bless the evening of her days. The father of Laura had ever been friendly to the house of Athlin, and her delicacy felt no repugnance to the union which Osbert solicited. But her happiness, whatever it might appear, was incomplete. She saw the settled melancholy of Mary, for love still corroded her heart, and notwithstanding her efforts, shaded her countenance. The Countess wished to produce those nuptials with the Count, which she thought would re-establish the peace of her child, and ensure her future felicity. She omitted no opportunity of pressing his suit, which she managed with a delicacy that rendered it less painful to Mary, whose words, however, were few in reply, and who could seldom bear that the subject should ever be long continued. Her settled aversion to the addresses of the Count at length baffled the expectations of Matilda, and showed her the fallacy of her efforts. She thought it improper to suffer the Count any longer to nourish in his heart a vain hope, and she reluctantly commissioned the Earl to undeceive him on this point. With the Baroness, month after month still elapsed in fruitless search of her son. The people with whom he had been placed were nowhere to be found, and no track was discovered which might lead to the truth. The distress of the Baroness can only be imagined. She resigned herself, in calm despair, to mourn in silence the easy confidence which had entrusted her child to the care of those who had betrayed him. Though happiness was denied her, she was unwilling to withhold it from those who it awaited, and at length yielded to the entreaties of the Earl, and became its advocate with Laura, for the nuptials which were to unite their fate. The Earl introduced the Countess and Mary to the castle of Dunbayne. Similarity of sentiment and disposition united Matilda and the Baroness in a lasting friendship. Mary and Laura were not less pleased with each other. The dejection of the Count at sight of Mary declared the ardor of his passion, and would have awakened in her breast something more than compassion had not her heart been preoccupied. Allen, who could think of Mary only, wandered through the castle of Athlin, a solitary being, who fondly haunts the spots where his happiness lies buried. His prudence formed resolutions, which his passion as quickly broke, and cheated by love, though followed by despair, he delayed his departure from day to day, and the illusion of yesterday continued to be the illusion of the morrow. The Earl, attached to his virtues, and grateful for his services, would have bestowed on him every honor but that alone which could give him happiness, and which his pride would have suffered him to accept. Yet the honors which he refused with a grace so modest as to conciliate kindness rather than wound generosity. In the gallery on the north side of the castle, which was filled with pictures of the family, hung a portrait of Mary. She was drawn in the dress which she wore on the day of the festival when she was led by the Earl into the hall and presented as the partner of Athlin. The likeness was striking and expressive of all the winning grace of the original. As often as Athlin could steal from observation, he retired to this gallery to contemplate the portrait of her who was ever present to his imagination. Here he could breathe that sigh which her presence restrained, and shed those tears which her presence forbade to flow. As he stood one day in this place wrapped in melancholy musing, his ear was struck with the notes of sweet music. They seemed to issue from the bottom of the gallery. The instrument was touched with an exquisite expression, and in a voice whose tones floated on the air in soft undulations, he distinguished the following words, which he remembered to be an ode composed by the Earl and presented to Mary, who had set it to music the day before. Morning, darkness, through thy chilling glooms, weakly trembles twilight grey. Twilight fades and morning comes, and melts thy shadows swift away. She comes in her ethereal car, involved in many a varying hue, and through the azure shoots afar, spirit light and life anew. Her breath revives the drooping flowers, her ray dissolves the dews of night, recalls the sprightly moving hours, and the green scene unveils in light. Hers the fresh gale that wanders wild o'er mountain top and dewy glade, and fondly steals the breath beguiled of every flower in every shade. Mother of roses, bright Aurora, hail! Thee shall the chorus of the hour salute, and song of early birds from every vale, and blithesome horn and fragrant zephyr mute. And oft as rising o'er the plain, thou and thy roseate nymphs appear. This simple song and choral strain from rapturing bards shall meet thine ear. Dance ye lightly, lightly on, 'tis the bold lark through the air, hails your beauties with his song, lightly, lightly, fleeting fair. Entranced in these sweet sounds, he had proceeded some steps down the gallery when the music ceased. He stopped. After a short pause it returned, and as he advanced he distinguished these words, sung in a low voice, mournfully sweet. In solitude I mourn thy reign, ah, youth beloved, but loved in vain. The voice was broken and lost in sobs. The chords of the lute were wildly struck, and in a few moments silence ensued. He stepped on towards the spot whence the sounds proceeded, and through a door which was left open he discovered Mary hanging over her lute, dissolved in tears. He stood for some moments absorbed in mute admiration, and unobserved by Mary, who was lost in her tears, till a sigh which escaped him recalled her to reality. She raised her eyes and beheld the object of her secret sorrows. She arose in confusion. The blush on her cheek betrayed her heart. She was retiring in haste from Athlin, who remained at the entrance of the room, the statue of despair, when she was intercepted by the Earl, who entered by the door she was opening. Her eyes were red with weeping. He glanced on her a look of surprise and displeasure, and passed on to the gallery, followed by Athlin, who was now awakened from his trance. From you, Athlin, said the Earl in a tone of displeasure, I expected other conduct. On your word I relied, and your word has deceived me. Hear me, my lord, returned the youth. Your confidence I had never abused. Hear me. I have now no time for parley, replied Osbert. My moments are precious. Some future hour of leisure may suffice. So saying, he walked away with an abrupt haughtiness which touched the soul of Athlin, who disdained to pursue him with further explanation. He was now completely wretched. The same accident which had unveiled to him the heart of Mary, and the full extent of that happiness which fate withheld, confirmed him in despair. The same accident had exposed the delicacy of her he loved to a cruel shock, and had subjected his honor to suspicion, and to a severe rebuke from him by whom it was his pride to be respected, and for whose safety he had suffered imprisonment, and encountered death. Mary had quitted the closet distressed and perplexed. She perceived the mistake of the Earl, and it shocked her. She wished to undeceive him, but he was gone to the castle of Dunbayne to pay one of those visits which were soon to conclude in the nuptials, and whence he did not return till evening. The scene which he had witnessed in the morning involved him in tumult of distress. He considered the mutual passion which filled the bosom of his sister and Athlin. He had surprised them in a solitary apartment. He had observed the tender and melancholy air of Athlin, and with tears and confusion of Mary, and he at first did not hesitate to believe that the interview had been appointed. In the heat of his displeasure, he had rejected the explanation of Athlin with a haughty resentment, which the late scene alone could have excited, and which the delusion it had occasioned alone could excuse. Cooler consideration, however, brought to his mind the delicacy and the amiable pride of Mary, and the integrity of Athlin, and he accused himself of a too hasty decision. The zealous services of Athlin came to his heart. He repented that he had treated him so rigorously, and on his return inquired for him, that he might hear an explanation, and that he might soften the asperity of his former behavior. End of chapter. Chapter 11. Athlin was nowhere to be found. The Earl went himself in quest of him, but without success. As he returned from the terrace, chagrined and disappointed, he observed two persons cross the platform at some distance before him, and he could perceive by the dim moonlight which fell upon the spot that they were not of the castle. He called to them. No answer was returned, but at the sound of his voice they quickened their pace and almost instantly disappeared in the darkness of the ramparts. Surprised at this phenomenon, the Earl followed with hasty steps, and endeavored to pursue the way they had taken. He walked on silently, but there was no sound to direct his steps. When he came to the extremity of the rampart, which formed the north angle of the castle, he stopped to examine the spot, and to listen if anything was stirring. No person was to be seen, and all was hushed. After he had stood some time surveying the rampart, he heard the low, restrained voice of a person unknown, but the distance prevented his distinguishing the subject of the conversation. The voice seemed to approach the place where he stood. He drew his sword and watched in silence their motions. They continued to advance, till, suddenly stopping, they turned and took a long survey of the fabric. Their discourse was conducted in a low tone, but the Earl could discover by the vehemence of their gesture and the caution of their steps that they were upon some design dangerous to the peace of the castle. Having finished their examination, they turned again towards the place where the Earl still remained. The shade of a high turret concealed him from their view, and they continued to approach till they arrived within a short space of him, when they turned through a ruined archway of the castle and were lost in the dark recesses of the pile. Astonished at what he had seen, Osbert hastened to the castle, whence he dispatched some of his people in search of the unknown fugitives. He accompanied some of his domestics to the spot where they had last disappeared. They entered the archway, which led to a decayed part of the castle. They followed over broken pavement the remains of a passage, which was closed by a low, obscure door, almost concealed from sight by the thick ivy which overshadowed it. On opening this door, they defended a flight of steps which led under the castle, so extremely narrow and broken as to make the defense both difficult and dangerous. The powerful dance of long pent-up vapors extinguished their light, and the Earl and his attendants were compelled to remain in utter darkness, while one of them went round to the habitable part of the castle to relume the lamp. While they awaited in silence the return of a light, a short breathing was distinctly heard at intervals, near the place where they stood. The servant shook with fear, and the Earl was not wholly unmoved. They remained entirely silent, listening its return, when a sound of footsteps slowly stealing through the vault startled them. The Earl demanded who passed. He was answered only by the deep echoes of his voice. They clashed their swords and advanced, when the steps hastily retired before them. The Earl rushed forward, pursuing the sound, till overtaking the person who fled, he seized him. A short scuffle ensued. The strength of Osbert was too powerful for his antagonist, who was nearly overcome. When the point of a sword from an unknown hand pierced his side, he relinquished his grasp and fell to the ground. His domestics, whom the activity of their master had outran, now came up. But the assassins, whoever they were, had accomplished their escape, for the sound of their footsteps was quickly lost in the distance of the vaults. They endeavored to raise the Earl, who lay speechless on the ground, but they knew not how to convey him from that place of horror, for they were yet in total darkness and unacquainted with the place. In this situation, every moment of delay seemed an age. Some of them tried to find their way to the entrance, but their efforts were defeated by the darkness and the ruinous situation of the place. The light at length appeared, and discovered the Earl insensible and weltering in his blood. He was conveyed into the castle, where the horror of the Countess on seeing him borne into the hall may be easily imagined. By the help of proper applications, he was restored to life. His wound was examined and found to be dangerous. He was carried to bed in a state which gave very faint hopes of recovery. The astonishment of the Countess on hearing the adventure was equalled only by her distress. All her conjectures concerning the designs and the identity of the assassin were vague and uncertain. She knew not on whom to fix the stigma, nor could discover any means by which to penetrate this mysterious affair. The people who had remained in the vaults to pursue the search now returned to Matilda. Every recess of the castle and every part of the ramparts had been explored, yet no one could be found, and the mystery of the proceeding was heightened by the manner in which the men had effected their escape. Mary watched over her brother in silent anguish, yet she strove to conceal her distress, that she might encourage the Countess to hope. The Countess endeavoured to resign herself to the event with a kind of desperate fortitude. There is a certain point of misery beyond which the mind becomes callous and acquires a sort of artificial calm. Excess of misery may be said to blast the vital powers of feeling, and by a natural consequence consumes its own principle. Thus it was with Matilda. A long succession of trials had reduced her to a state of horrid tranquillity, which followed the first shock of the present event. It was not so with Laura. Young in misfortune and gay in hope, she saw happiness fade from her grasp, with a warmth of feeling untouched by the chill of disappointment. When the news of the Earl's situation reached her, she was overcome with affliction, and pined in silent anguish. The Count hastened to Osbert, but grief sat heavy at his heart, and he had no power to offer to others the comfort which he wanted himself. A fever, which was the consequence of his wounds, added to the danger of the Earl, and to the despair of his family. During this period, Allen had not been seen at the castle, and his absence at this time raised in Mary a variety of distressing apprehensions. Osbert inquired for him, and wished to see him. The servant who had been sent to his father's cottage brought word that it was some days since he had been there, and that nobody knew whither he was gone. The surprise was universal, but the effect it produced was various and opposite. A collection of strange and concomitant circumstances now forced a suspicion in the mind of the Countess, which her heart and the remembrance of the former conduct of Arwen had once condemned. She had heard of what passed between the Earl and him in the gallery. His immediate absence, the events which followed, and his subsequent flight formed a chain of evidence which compelled her, with the utmost reluctance, to believe him concerned in the affair which had once more involved her house in misery. Mary had too much confidence in her knowledge of his character to admit a suspicion of this nature. She rejected, with instant disdain, the idea of uniting Owen with dishonour, and that he should be guilty of an action so base as the present soared beyond all the bounds of possibility. Yet she felt a strange solicitude concerning him, and apprehension for his safety tormented her incessantly. The anguish in which he had quitted the apartment, her brother's injurious treatment, and his consequent absence all conspired to make her fear that despair had driven him to commit some act of violence on himself. The Earl, in the delirium of the fever, raved continually of Laura and of Athlin. They were the sole subjects of his ramblings. Seizing one day the hand of Mary, who sat mournfully by his bedside, and looking for some time pensively in her face, "Weep not, my Mora," said he. "Malcolm, nor all the powers on earth shall tear you from me. His walls, his guards, what are they? I'll wrest you from his hold, or perish. I have a friend whose valor will do much for us. A friend, oh, name him not. These are strange times. Beware of trusting. I could have given him my very life, but I will not name him." Then, starting to the other side of the bed, and looking earnestly towards the door with an expression of sorrow not to be described, "Not all the miseries which my worst enemy has heaped upon me, not all the horrors of imprisonment and death have ever touched my soul with a sting so sharp as thy unfaithfulness." Mary was so much shocked by this scene that she left the room and retired to her own apartment to indulge the agony of grief it occasioned. The situation of the Earl grew daily more alarming, and the fever, which had not yet reached its crisis, kept the hopes and fears of his family suspended. In one of his lucid intervals, addressing himself to the Countess in the most pathetic manner, he requested that as death might probably soon separate him for ever from her he most loved, he might see Laura once again before he died. She came, and weeping over him, a scene of anguish ensued too poignant for description. He gave her his last vows. She took of him a last look, and with a breaking heart tearing herself away, was carried to Dunbayne in a state of danger little inferior to his. The agitation he had suffered during his interview caused a return of frenzy more violent than any fit he had yet suffered. Exhausted by it, he at length sunk into a sleep, which continued without interruption for near 24 hours. During this time, his repose was quiet and profound, and afforded the Countess and Mary, who watched him alternately, the consolations of hope. When he awoke, he was perfectly sensible, and in a very altered state from that he had been in a few hours before. The crisis of the disorder was now past, and from that time it rapidly declined till he was restored to perfect health. The joy of Laura, whose health gradually returned with returning peace, and that of his family, was such as the merits of the Earl deserved. This joy, however, suffered a short interruption from the Count of Sedmoring, who, entering one morning the apartment of the Baroness, with letters in his hand, came to acquaint her that he had just received news of the death of a distant relation, who had bequeathed him some estates of value, to which it was necessary he should immediately lay claim, and that he was, therefore, obliged, however reluctantly, to set off for Switzerland without delay. Though the Baroness rejoiced with all his friends at his good fortune, she regretted with them the necessity of his abrupt departure. He took leave of them, and particularly of Mary, for whom his passion was still the same, with much emotion. And it was some time ere the space he had left in their society was filled up, and ere they resumed their wonted cheerfulness. Preparations were now making for the approaching nuptials, and the day of their celebration was at length fixed. The ceremony was to be performed in the chapel belonging to the castle of Dunbayne by the chaplain of the Baroness. Mary only was to attend as bridemaid, and the Countess also, with the Baroness, was to be present. The absence of the Count was universally regretted, for from his hand the Earl was to have received his bride. The office was now to be supplied by a neighbouring laird, whom the family of the Baroness had long esteemed. At the earnest request of Laura, Mary consented to spend the night preceding the day of marriage at the castle of Dunbayne. The day so long and so anxiously expected by the Earl at length arrived. The morning was extremely fine, and the joy which glowed in his heart seemed to give additional splendour to the scene around him. He set off, accompanied by the Countess, for the castle of Dunbayne. He anticipated with joy with which he should soon retrace the way he then travelled, with Laura by his side, whom death alone could then separate from him. On their arrival they were received by the Baroness, who had enquired for Mary, and the Countess and Osbert were thrown into the utmost consternation when they learned that she had not been seen at the castle. The nuptials were again deferred. The castle was a scene of universal confusion. The Earl returned home instantly to dispatch his people in search of Mary. On enquiry, he learned that the servants who had attended her had not been heard of since their departure with their baby. Still more alarmed by this intelligence, he rode himself in pursuit, yet not knowing which course to take. Several days were employed in a fruitless search. No footstep of her flight could be traced. End of chapter. Chapter 12. Mary, in the meantime, suffered all the terror which her situation could excite. On her way to Dunbayne, she had been overtaken by a party of armed men who seized her bridle, and after engaging her servants in a feigned resistance, carried her off senseless. On recovering, she found herself travelling through a forest whose glooms were deepened by the shades of night. The moon, which was now up, glancing through the trees, served to show the dreary aspect of the place, and the number of men who surrounded her, and she was seized with a terror that almost deprived her of reason. They travelled all night, during which a profound silence was observed. At the dawn of day, she found herself on the skirts of a heath, to which wide desolation her eye could discover no limits. Before they entered on the waste, they halted at the entrance of a cave formed in a rock, which was overhung with pine and fir, where, spreading their breakfast on the grass, they offered refreshments to Mary, whose mind was too much distracted to suffer her to partake of them. She implored them in the most moving accents to tell her from whom they came, and whither they were carrying her. But they were insensible to her tears and her entreaties, and she was compelled to await in silent terror the extremity of her fate. They pursued their journey over the wilds, and towards the close of day approached the ruins of an abbey, whose broken arches and lonely towers arose in gloomy grandeur through the obscurity of evening. It stood the solitary inhabitant of the waste, a monument of mortality and of ancient superstition, and the frowning majesty of its aspect seemed to command silence and veneration. The chilly dews fell thick, and Mary, fatigued in body and harassed in mind, lay almost expiring on her horse, when they stopped under an arch of the ruin. She was not so ill as to be insensible to the objects around her, the awful solitude of the place, and the sullen aspect of the fabric, whose effect was heightened by the falling glooms of evening, chilled her heart with horror, and when they took her from the horse, she shrieked in the agonies of a last despair. They bore her over loose stones to a part of the building, which had been formerly the cloisters of the abbey, but which was now fallen to decay and overgrown with ivy. There was, however, at the extremity of these cloisters, a nook, which had withstood with hardier strength the ravages of time. The roof was here entire, and the shattered stanchions of the casements still remained. Hither they carried Mary, and made her almost lifeless on the grassy pavement, while some of the ruffians hastened to light a fire of the heath and sticks they could pick up. They took out their provisions and placed themselves round the fire, where they had not long been seated when the sound of distant thunder foretold an approaching storm. A violent storm, accompanied with peals which shook the pile, came on. They were sheltered from the heaviness of the rain, but the long and vivid flashes of lightning which glanced through the casements alarmed them all. The shrieks of Mary were loud and continued, and the fears of the ruffians did not prevent their uttering dreadful imprecations at her distress. One of them, in the fury of his resentment, swore she should be gagged, and fusing her resistless hands to execute the purpose, her cries redoubled. The servants who had betrayed her were not yet so entirely lost to the feelings of humanity as to stand regardless of her present distress. Though they could not resist the temptations of a bribe, they were unwilling their lady should be loaded with unnecessary misery. They opposed the ruffians. A dispute ensued, and the violence of the contest arose so high that they determined to fight for the decision. Amid the peals of thunder, the oaths and execrations of the combatants added terror to the scene. The strength of the ruffians were superior to that of their opponents, and Mary, beholding victory deciding against herself, uttered a loud scream, when the attention of the whole party was surprised by the sound of a footstep in the cloister. Immediately after, a man rushed into the place, and drawing his sword, demanded the cause of the tumult. Mary, who lay almost expiring on the ground, now raised her eyes. But what were her sensations when she raised them to Athlin, who now stood before her petrified with horror? Before he could fly to her assistance, the attacks of the ruffians obliged him to defend himself. He parried their blows for some time, but he must inevitably have yielded to the force of numbers, had not the trampling of feet which fast approached called off for a moment their attention. In an instant the place was filled with men. The astonishment of Athlin was, if possible, now increased, for the Earl, followed by a party, now entered. The Earl, when he perceived Athlin, stood at the entrance aghast, but resuming his firmness, he bade him defend himself. The loud voice of Osbert recalled Mary, and observing their menacing attitudes, she collected just strength sufficient to throw herself between them. Athlin dropped his sword and raised her from the ground, when the Earl rudely pushed him away and snatched her to his heart. "Hear me, Osbert," was all she could say. "Declare who brought her hither," said the Earl sternly to Athlin. "I know not," replied he. "You must ask those men whom your people have secured. If my life is hateful to you, strike, and spare me the anguish of defending it against the brother of Mary." The Earl hesitated in surprise, and the generosity of Athlin called a blush into his face. He was going to have replied, but was interrupted by some of his men, who had been engaged in a sharp contest with the ruffians, 2 of whom they had secured, and now brought to their lord. The rest were fled. In the person of one of them, the Earl discovered his own servant, who, sinking in his presence with conscious guilt, fell on his knees imploring mercy. "Wretch," said the Earl, seizing him and holding his sword over his head, "declare by whose authority you have acted, and all you know of the affair. Remember, your life depends on the truth of your assertions." "I'll tell the truth, my lord," replied the trembling wretch, "and nothing else, as I hope for mercy. About 3 weeks ago, no, it is not so much, about a fortnight ago, when I was sent on a message to the Waby Malcolm, the Count de St. Morin's gentleman." "The Count de St. Morin," re-echoed the whole company. "But proceed," said Osbert. "The Count de St. Morin's gentleman called me into a private room, where he told me to wait for his master, who would soon be there." "Be quick," said the Earl. "Proceed to facts." "I will, my lord. The Count came and said to me, "Robert, I have observed you, and I think you can be faithful." He said so, my lord. God forgive me. Well, proceed. Where was I? Oh, he said, "I think you can be faithful." Good God, this is beyond endurance, you trifle rascal, with my patience. To give your associates time for escape. Be brief or you die. I will, my lord, as I hope for life. He took from his pocket a handful of gold, which he gave me. Can you be secret, Robert? Said he. Yes, my lord Count, said I. God forgive me. Then observe what I say to you. You often attend your young lady in her rides to Dunbayne. What? Then it was the Count de St. who commissioned you to undertake this scheme? Not me only, my lord. Answer my question. Was the Count the author of this plot? He was, my lord. And where is he? Said Osbert in a stern voice. I know not, as I am a living creature. He embarked, as you know, my lord, not far from the castle of Dunbayne, and we were travelling to a distant part of the coast to meet him, when we were all to have set sail for Switzerland. You cannot be ignorant of the place of your destination, said the Earl, turning to the other prisoner. Where is your employer? That is not for me to tell, said he, in a sullen tone. Reveal the truth, said the Earl, turning towards him the point of his sword, or we will find a way to make you. The place where we were to meet the Count had no name. You know the way to it. I do. Then lead me thither. Never, never. Your life shall answer the refusal, said Osbert, pointing the sword to his breast. Strike, said the Count, throwing off the cloak which had concealed him. Strike, and rid me of a being which passion has made hateful to me. Strike, and make the first moment of my entering this place the last of my guilt. A faint scream was uttered by Mary. The small remains of her strength forsook her, and she sunk on the pavement. The Earl started a few steps back, and stood suspended in wonder. The looks of the whole group defy description. Take your sword, said the Earl, recovering himself, and defend your life. Never, my lord, never. Though I have been hurried by the force of passion to rob you of a sister, I will not aggravate my guilt by the murder of the brother. Your life has already been once endangered through my means, though not by my design. Heaven knows the anguish which that accident cost me. The impetuosity of passion impelled me onward with irresistible fury. It urged me to violate the sacred duties of gratitude, of friendship, and of humanity. To live in shame and in the consciousness of guilt is a living death. With your sword do justice to yourself and virtue, and spare me the misery of long comparing what I am with what I was. Away, you trifle, said the Earl. Defend yourself. The Count repeated his refusal. And you, villain, said Osbert, turning to the man who had confessed the plot, you pretended ignorance of the presence of the Count. Your perfidy shall be rewarded. As I now plead for mercy, my lord, I knew not he was here. The fellow speaks the truth, said the Count. He was ignorant of the place where he was to meet me. I was approaching this spot to discover myself to the dear object of my passion, when your people surprised and took me. Mary confirmed the testimony of the Count by declaring that she had not till that moment seen him since she quitted the castle of Dunbayne. She pleaded for his life, and also for the servants who had opposed the cruelty of their comrades. I am no assassin, said the Earl. Let the Count take a sword and fight me on equal terms. Shall virtue be reduced to an equality with vice? Said the Count. No, my lord. Plunge your sword in my heart and expiate my guilt. The Earl still urged him to defense, and the Count still persisted in refusal. Touched by the recollection of past friendship, and grieved that a soul like the Count should ever be under the dominion of vice, Osbert threw down his sword, and, overcome with a sort of tenderness, Go, my lord, your person is safe, and if it is necessary to your peace, stretching forth his hand, take my forgiveness. The Count, overcome by his generosity and by a sense of his own unworthiness, shrunk back. "Forbear, my lord, to wound by your goodness a mind already too sensible of its own debasement, nor excite by your generosity a remorse too keen to be endured. Your reproaches I can bear, your vengeance I solicit, but your kindness inflicts a torture too exquisite for my soul. Never, my lord," continued he, the big tear swelling in his eye, "never more shall your friendship be polluted by my unworthiness. Since you will not satisfy justice by taking my life, I go to lose it in the obscurity of distant regions. Yet, ere I go, suffer me to make one last request to you and to that dear lady whom I have thus injured, and on whom my eyes now gaze for the last time. Suffer me to hope that you will blot from your memory the existence of Fantmorin." He concluded the sentence with a groan which vibrated upon the hearts of all present, and without waiting for a reply, hurried from the scene. The Earl had turned away his head in pity, and when he again looked round to reply, perceived that the Count was departed. He followed his steps through the cloister. He called, but he was gone. Owen had observed the Count with a mixture of pity and admiration, and he sighed for the weakness of human nature. "How," said the Earl, returning eagerly to Allen, "how can I recompense you for my injurious suspicions and my injurious treatment? How can you forgive, or I forget my injustice? But the mystery of this affair and the doubtful appearance of circumstances must speak for me." "Oh, let us talk no more of this, my lord," replied Allen with emotion. "Let us only rejoice at the safety of our dear lady, and offer her the comfort she is so much in want of." The fire was rekindled, and the Earl's servants laid before him some wine and other provisions. Mary, who had not tasted any food since she left the castle, now took some wine. It revived her, and enabled her to take other nourishment. She inquired what happy circumstance had enabled the Earl to trace her route. "Ever since I discovered your flight," said he, "I have been in pursuit of you. Chance directed me over these wilds, when I was driven by the storm to seek shelter among these ruins. The light and an uproar of voices drew me to the cloister, where, to my unutterable astonishment, I discovered you and Allen. Spare me the remembrance of what followed." Mary wished to inquire what brought Allen to the place, but delicacy kept her silent. Osbert, however, whose anxiety for his sister had hitherto allowed him to attend only to her, now relieved her from the pain of lengthened suspense. "By what strange accident was you brought hither?" said he to Allen, "and what motive has induced you so long to absent yourself from the castle?" At the last question Allen blushed, and an involuntary sigh escaped him. Mary understood the blush and the sigh, and awaited his reply in trembling emotion. "I fled, my lord, from your displeasure, and to tear myself from an object too dangerous, alas, from my peace. I sought to wear away in absence a passion which must ever be hopeless, but which, I now perceive, is interwoven with my existence. But forgive, my lord, the intrusion of a subject which is painful to us all. With some money and a few provisions, I left my father's cottage, and since that time have wandered over the country a forlorn and miserable being, passing my nights in the huts which chance threw in my way, and designing to travel onward, and to enlist myself in the service of my country. Night overtook me on these wastes, and as I walked on comfortless and bewildered, I was alarmed by distant cries of distress. I quickened my pace, but the sound which should have directed my steps was ceased, and chilling silence ensued. As I stood musing and uncertain which course to take, I observed a feeble light break through the gloom. I endeavored to follow its rays. It led me to these ruins, whose solemn appearance struck me with a momentary dread. A confused murmur of voices from within struck my ear as I stood hesitating whether to enter. I again heard those shrieks which had alarmed me. I followed the sound. It led me to the entrance of this cloister, and at the extremity of which I discovered a party of men engaged in fight. I drew my sword and rushed forward, and the sensation which I felt on perceiving the Lady Mary cannot be expressed. Still heaven destined you the deliverer of Mary, said the Earl, gratitude swelling in his eyes. Oh, that I could remove the obstacle which withholds you from her just reward. A responsive sigh stole from Athlin, and he remained silent. Never was the struggle of opposing feelings more violent than that which now agitated the bosom of the Earl. The worth of Athlin arose more conspicuously bright from every shade with which misfortune had veiled it. His noble and disinterested enthusiasm in the cause of justice had attached him to the Earl, and had engaged him in a course of enterprises and of dangers which it required valor to undertake, and skill and perseverance to perform, and which had produced services for which no adequate reward could be found. He had rescued the Earl from captivity and death, and had twice preserved Mary in dangers. All these circumstances arose in strong reflection to the mind of Osbert, but the darkness of prejudice and ancient pride opposed their influence and weakened their effect. The joy which Mary felt on seeing Athlin in safety, and still worthy of the esteem she had ever bore him, was dashed by the bitterness of reflection, and reflection imparted a melancholy which added to the languor of illness. At the dawn of day they quitted the abbey and set forward on their return to the castle, the Earl insisting upon Athlin's accompanying them. On the way the minds of the party were variously and silently engaged. The Earl ruminated on the conduct of Athlin and the late scene. Mary dwelt chiefly on the virtues of her lover and on the dangers she had escaped, and Athlin mused on his defeated purposes and the anticipated future trials. The Earl's thoughts, however, were not so wholly occupied as to prevent his questioning the servant who had been employed by the Count concerning the further particulars of his scheme. The words of the Count, importing that he had once already endangered his life, had not escaped the notice of the Earl, though they were uttered in a moment of too much distraction to suffer him to demand an explanation. He now inquired of the man concerning the mysterious scene of the vaults. You, I suppose, are not ignorant who were the persons from whom I received my wound. I, my lord, had no concern in that affair. Wicked as I am, I could not raise my hands against your life. But you know who did. Yes, my lord. I was afterwards told, but they did not mean to hurt your lordship. Not mean to hurt me? What then were their designs, and who were the people? That accident happened long before the Count ever spoke to me of his purpose. Indeed, my lord, I had no hand in it, and heaven knows how I grieved for your lordship. And, well, inform me, who were the persons in the vaults, and what were their design? I was told by a fellow servant, but he made me promise to be secret. But it is proper your lordship should know all, and I hope your lordship will forgive me for having listened to it. Robert, said he, as we were walking one day of what had happened, Robert, said he, there is more in this matter than you or anybody thinks, but it is not for me to tell all I know. With that, I begged he would tell me what he knew. He still kept refusing. I promised him faithfully I would not tell, and so at last he told me. Why, there is my Lord Count there. He is in love with our young lady, and to be sure as sweet a lady she is, as ever eyes looked upon. But she don't like him, and so finding himself refused, he is determined to marry her at any rate, and means some night to get into the castle and carry her off. What then? Was it the Count who wounded me? Be quick in your remission. No, my lord, it was not the Count himself, but two of his people, whom he had sent to examine the castle, and particularly the windows of my young lady's apartment, from whence he designed to have carried her, when everything was ready for execution. Those men were let within the walls through a way underground, which leads into the vaults, by my fellow servant, as I afterwards was told, and they escaped through the same way. Their meeting with your lordship was accidental, and they fought only in self-defense, for they had no orders to attack anybody. And who is the villain that connived at this scheme? It was my fellow servant who fled with the count's people, whom he himself left within the ramparts. Forgive me, my lord, but I did not dare tell. He threatened my life if I betrayed the secret. After a journey of fatigued and unpleasant reflections, they arrived on the second morning at the castle of Athlin. The countess, during the absence of her son, had endured a state of dreadful suspense. The baroness, in her friendship, had endeavored to soothe her distress by her constant presence. She was engaged in this amiable office when the trampling of horses in the court reached the ears of Matilda. "It is my son," said she, rising from her chair. "It is my son. He brings me life or death." She said no more, but rushed into the hall, and in a moment after clasped her almost expiring daughter to her bosom. The transport of the scene repelled utterance. Sobs and tears were all that could be given. The general joy, however, was suddenly interrupted by the baroness, who had followed Matilda into the hall, and who now fell senseless to the ground. Delight yielded to surprise, and to the business of assisting the object of it. On recovering, the baroness looked wildly around her. Was it a vision that I saw, or a reality? The whole company moved their eyes round the hall, but could discover nothing extraordinary. It was himself, his very air, his features, that benign countenance which I have so often contemplated in imagination. Her eyes still seemed in search of some ideal object, and they began to doubt whether a sudden frenzy had not seized her brain. "Ah, again!" said she, and instantly relapsed. Their eyes were now turned towards the door on which she had gazed. It was Allen who entered, with water which he had brought for the countess, and on whom the attention of all present was centred. He approached ignorant of what had happened, and his surprise was great when the baroness, reviving, fixed her eyes mournfully upon him and asked him to uncover his arm. It is my Philip," said she with strong emotion. "I have, indeed, found my long-lost child. That strawberry on his arm confirms the decision. Send for the man who calls himself your father, and for my servant Patrick." The sensations of the mother and the son may be more easily conceived than described. Those of Mary were little inferior to theirs, and the whole company awaited with trembling eagerness the arrival of the two persons whose testimony was to decide this interesting affair. They came. "This young man you call your son?" said the baroness. "I do, and please your ladyship," he replied, with a degree of confusion which belied his words. When Patrick came, his instant surprise on seeing the old man declared the truth. "Do you know this person?" said the baroness to Patrick. "Yes, my lady, I know him too well. It was to him I gave your infant son." The old man started with surprise. "Is that youth the son of your ladyship?" "Yes." "Then God forgive me for having thus long detained him from you, but I was ignorant of his birth, and received him into my cottage as a foundling succoured by Lord Malcolm's compassion." The whole company crowded round them. Allen fell at the feet of his mother, and bathed her hand with his tears. "Gracious God, for what hast thou reserved me?" He could say no more. The baroness raised him, and again pressed him in transport to her heart. It was some time before either of them could speak, and all present were too much affected to interrupt the silence. At length the baroness presented Laura to her brother. "Such a mother, and have I such a sister," said he. Laura wept silently upon his neck the joy of her heart. The Earl was the first who recovered composure sufficient to congratulate Allen, and embracing him, "Oh, happy moment when I can indeed embrace you as my brother." The whole company now poured forth their joy and their congratulations, all but Mary, whose emotions almost overcame her and were too powerful for utterance. The company now adjourned to the drawing-room, and Mary withdrew to take that repose she so much required. She was sufficiently recovered in a few hours to join her friends in the banqueting-room. After the transports of the scene were subsided, "I have yet much to hope and much to fear," said Philip Malcolm, who was yet Allen in everything but in name. "You, madam," addressing the Baroness, "you will willingly become my advocate with her whom I have so long and so ardently loved. May I hope," continued he, taking tenderly the hair of Mary, who stood trembling by, "that you have not been insensible to my long attachment, and that you will confirm the happiness which is now offered me?" A smile of ineffable sweetness broke through the melancholy which had long clouded her features, and which even the present discovery had not been able entirely to dissipate, and her eye gave the consent which her tongue refused to utter. The conversation for the remainder of the day was occupied by the subject of the discovery, and with a recital of Mary's adventure. It was determined that on the morrow the marriage of the Earl should be concluded. On this happy discovery, the Earl ordered the gates of the castle to be thrown open. Mirth and festivity resounded through the walls, and the evening closed in universal rejoicings. On the following morn, the chapel of the castle was decorated for the marriage of the Earl, who with Laura came attended by Philip, now Baron Malcolm, by Mary and the whole family. When they approached the altar, the Earl, addressing himself to his bride, "Now, my Laura," said he, "we may celebrate those nuptials which have twice been so painfully interrupted, and which are to crown me with felicity. This day shall unite our families in a double marriage, and reward the worth of my friend. It is now seen that those virtues which stimulated him to prosecute for another the cause of justice mysteriously urged him to the recovery of his rights. Virtue may for a time be pursued by misfortune, and justice be obscured by the transient triumphs of vice. But the power whose peculiar attributes they are clears away the clouds of error, and even in this world reveals his throne of justice." The Earl stepped forward, and joining the hands of Philip and Mary, "Surely," said he, "this is a moment of perfect happiness. I can now reward those virtues which I have ever loved, and those services to which every gift must be inadequate, but this I now bestow." The End. Read by Amanda Eland for Lip to Go.